Hey everyone, and welcome to a new video. So this is something different today. It's kind of a crazy adventure, since I want to create a 2D game in Max, completely in Max, completely in JavaScript, or as far as possible in JavaScript. And it's a long video. It's a lot of stuff, but we're going to see a lot of JavaScript and OpenGL in JavaScript. And in the course of this video game creation, we're going to highlight a lot of features, I think. So this is what you're going to achieve in this video. We got like this starship of the player firing some projectiles. So one thing is that I'm not going to explain how JavaScript works. This I kind of assume the viewer already knows. But I'm going to comment everything I do. So even if you don't know much about JavaScript programming or OpenGL programming in Max, this should be nevertheless pretty helpful. But I'm very curious to know your feedback about it, so please, if something isn't clear, just let me know. And so without any further ado, let's jump in the coding. Okay, so let's start. First thing we need, of course, is a JS file. And we're going to call it game.js. Why not? Of course, file doesn't exist. I'm going to auto watch it, save this thing. I'm going to save it in the same folder where my patcher is, right? So that's the folder where my patcher is. There is a folder inside called sprites. Then there is my game.maxpath and then my game.js, which I've just created. I'm going to open this game.js into Visual Studio Code, and there we have it. So we can better edit it. Great. So first thing we need is that we need some sprites for our game, some assets. And there is this great website, which is called Kenney.nl, so Kenney guy. It makes a lot of assets for video game for free, so that's amazing. You can support him on Patreon, him or her. And then here we can download these sprites. So that's what I've just done. I downloaded this package, which is a couple of images. So I put here in my asset folder, Kenney, Tilemap, right? So what I'm going to do now is to use my new object that I just created, which is for free, downloadable, link in the description, which is called sprites.sheetslicer. And what this does is exactly to just slice a sprite sheet directly from within Max. There are tools online that do it as well, other free programs. You can do it in 1,000 different ways, but this is the way to do it inside Max directly. So I open the help file of this object. That's the help file. I'm just going to drop it the ships packed.png. Packed means that there is no space between the different ships. Alright, so this is 192 height divided by 6, so I'm just going to do here 992 divided by 6. This is 32 pixels, so if I put here 32 pixels, it's going to slice it into sprites with 32 pixels each. I'm going to slice them, I'm going to export them. So actually I'm going to my desktop, creating a folder called sprites. That's a bit silly, but for the moment I'm going to do it. And then just save everything inside this folder. Then I'm going to Ctrl-X them, go into my project folder, where my max patch is. Into the sprites folder, I'm just going to paste them inside here. So great. Then I'm going to do the same with the other image downloaded from Kenney. So Kenney, tilemap, I'm going to get this tiles packed.png from this link that I just showed you. These are two images. One is with the ships, and the other is with all these kind of ground stuff and projectiles. This is all we need. So I'm going to drop it here. And okay, this also seems to be 32 by 32. So I'm just going to slice them, export them to the same folder. So then I go to desktop, sprites. There they are. I Ctrl-A, Ctrl-X them all, and then I go here into sprites, in my project folder, let's call it, and I just paste them all inside here. Awesome. And I think I'm going to use the first one as the player starship, so I'm just going to rename it like player starship.png. Okay, for the moment that's good. Let's close this here, let's close the help file, no, we don't need it anymore, let's delete the object. Great, so let's start to code. So what I like to do when working with JavaScript is to create several classes for every kind of main object that we need in our project. So for example, in this case, we need definitely a starship class, which we'll then use to create an instance that will be the starship of the player and then all the enemy starships. But before we even do that, I want to create actually a class which is called assets, which will contain all the assets we want to load into our game. Because we are not going to load the images every time we create a new instance of a class, we're just going to refer them to this asset class. So I'm going to include here a file which we are going to call gameassets.javascript. So with include, we can use another file like if it was written inside this main file, but it just helps to keep stuff clean. So I'm going to create a new, not a new window, but a new file. I'm going to save it inside my game folder, where the max patch is, of course, and I'm going to call it, as we just said, game_assets.js. So in our game assets file, I'm going to create our game assets class, and I'm going to just call it assets. That's a function, and this class is going to have, of course, an instance of the image of the player starship, let's say. So player starship, that's a new jitter matrix. Anyway, right. Let's call it actually mat player ship, so we know without any doubt this is a matrix, and then it needs also then a function to load this matrix. So let's call a function, let's create a function and call it load assets as a property of this object. And as you can see, I'm writing functions that are property of objects. I'm writing them with a uppercase letter. That's just how I'm going to do it. And we need also the folder path for that. Good. And then here we need to say this mat.playership.import movie. And we're going to need a folder path for that, plus the name of the image we want to import for that. So I'm just going to hard code that. And this is our player starship.png. Just going to copy the name of this image. So player starship.png, we need also actually a slash, because the folder path that we input is not going to contain this slash. Okay, cool. Now just to check that everything worked, we can actually outlet this image, this matrix name, just to check that everything worked. So we can then display it in our patch with a GP window. Good. So I'm going to go into game, and I'm going to create a public function that we can call from max, which is going to be load assets. And we need our path, our folder path actually. And actually we need an instance first of our game assets class. So var, let's call it g assets. I'm going to prefix all the global variables with a g, just so we know that they are global variables, and this is a new object of the assets class. Not assets. I hate this autocomplete. Okay, new assets. So g assets.load assets, and we need a folder path here. Okay, nice. Let's go now in our max patch. Let's here say prepend jit matrix. So if you are lucky, we get the name of the matrix, we can prepend it with a jit matrix and then display it into a JP window. So we call this function load assets. So I'm going to go here, say load assets. Since this folder is inside the same folder in which we are at the moment, this should work. So it's inside sprites. So let's see. Oh, it worked. Guys, I was not expecting this, but actually it seems we did everything correctly, so it worked. Cool. Now, let's create our player class. So basically our player ship class. So I'm going to create this into a new file. Create a new file, save it. We're going to say this is a JavaScript file. I'm going to call it game player ship. Yeah, I'm going to call it player ship. I'm going to include it here in the main file. So game underscore playership.js. Good. I'm going to go here, creating a new function. We call it playership. Also, class's name I'm going to write with a capital letter. That just makes it easy to recognize that this is a class and not just a random function. Okay, so what we need here is an instance of the ship sprite. So let's call it this ship sprite. So let's assign it to null just to begin, and then we create a function. This assign ship sprite or something like that. It's equal to a function, and this ship sprite is going to be equal to something that we pass to this function, and I think this is going to be a ship sprite. And now, what's a ship sprite? So what's a sprite? So I think a sprite in our context is going to be basically an image attached to a video plane. So I guess we actually need also a sprite class that we can then call from the assets class, and we can also call from the playership class in order to attach these to the single elements of our game, because we don't want to create video planes and matrices inside our playership class. We just want to get them directly from our assets class. So I'm going to create a new class, call it sprite. And what this is going to have is going to have a video plane, so which we're going to call VP, and this is a new jitter object, ggl video plane, and this needs to draw to our world name, which is called game. So for the moment, I'm just going to hard code the name of our world as a global variable, so g world name, and I'm just going to hard code it. There are better ways to do that, but for the moment we will just keep it always the same. So we are going to use a global variable hard-coded. So this is going to draw to our world name. Okay, great. And then we need also a matrix containing actually the matrix assigned to this video plane. So this image mat, actually let's call this mat image. It's going to be a new jitter matrix. Awesome. And then we need the function to load our image into this sprite object. So this load image, it's going to be a function that gets actually the path of the image to load. And then this mat image.import movie and then path. Okay, great. And then we want to assign this image to our video plane. So this vp.jit matrix, so we're going to pass this as a matrix to the video plane. It's going to be this.matimage.name. So we're going to pass the name of this matrix. Okay, great. So now inside our load assets thing, I think we actually want to create this inside the assets. We don't want to create this as a new jitter matrix. We want to call this sprite player starship, and this is going to be a new sprite object, right? And then when we load it, they say this sprite player starship load image with this path. This we don't need anymore, and this should work. Believe it or not, this should work. We load the image inside our sprite object, which will then load it inside the video plane, and we should see it in our window. So let's see if this works. Before we try that, we actually need also a function to destroy this sprite, because these are two C objects actually created from within JavaScript that are going to occupy our RAM memory. So we need to, every time we destroy the JavaScript object, these objects must be destroyed, and we must do this manually. So I'm going to create a function, call it destroy, and it's going to be a new function. And I'm going to say this vp.freePeer. That's the function we have to call to free the memory for this object, and this mat image.freePeer. Right. So we go now into, I guess what we should do is in our assets to call a function destroy. To create a function called destroy as well. And we should say this sprite player starship.destroy. So we're going to call the function that we just created inside our sprite object. And then inside our main file, there are some functions called by max directly. One of those is the notify deleted, which is a function that is called automatically by max every time we delete the object. So we can define it and say, okay, gassets.destroy. So every time we delete this max object, we basically will destroy, will free the memory that we have been occupying. Let's post the message also here. Let's just say cleaning. Good. Then post a new line. Good. So every time I destroy this JS object, it will free the memory that we just occupied with our C objects. So this seems to work. Load assets. We now should be able to load these assets, and this should actually appear. We should see the image of the starship appearing in our world. Oh, and there it is. There it is. It's just occupying the whole world, which is not something that we want. We want to have it smaller. So let's go into our sprite class and give it also a scale property. And let's define it just as a single number, since we want to scale anyway all the axes for the same number. Let's give it a default number of 0.2. So I guess actually we should create a function, call it scale sprite. And we need here a scale value, scale val. And then we can go to this vp.scale and scale it to our scale value. Actually, let's also assign this .scale to the scale value. So we always have a reference to what is the current scale value. Could actually get it also from the video plane, but let's just create a scale value. Let's now call this function. As soon as we load the image, we can say this scale sprite. We're going to scale it to actually this scale. Does this make sense? Not much, but it's okay. For the moment, we're just going to do it like this. So I'm going to save the main file, because every time I modify some of the included files, I also have to modify the, also have to save the main file in order for these changes to apply. It didn't work. This VP scale is not a function. In fact, I think it's an attribute of the object, which means we have to assign it like this with an equal symbol, simply. Okay, so let's give it a try. Yes, there it is. And as you can see, there is a black rectangle around our sprite, and I think this will go away when we say blend enable. So let's actually do like this. Let's assign this as a hard-coded in our sprite object class. Let's say this VP blend enable is equal to 1. Good. Saving here, reloading the assets, and there they are. Great. The thing is, we don't want actually this asset to appear before we create an instance of our playership class. So what we're going to do is to put this the video plane disabled by default. So video plane enable equals 0. That's an attribute of the video plane object. Okay, cool. And when we assign it to the sprite of our playership, then we are actually going to enable it. Okay, so in our game playership class, we should then enable this sprite once assigned. So let's maybe create a function in our sprite class. This enable sprite. So function. Let's give it the value. So this .vp.enable it's equal to val, right? So once we assign it here to the ship sprite, then we want to enable, so this ship sprite dot enable sprite 1. Okay, so we're going to enable it. Good. Okay, so let's assign this asset to our ship sprite. First, let's just try like this and check that our sprite is not appearing. Okay, good. So load assets, and I guess then we should assign them. So let's first create the instance of our starship class. Player ship. This is a new player ship class. Player ship object. Right. And then we need to assign this to the starship sprite. So how did we say it? Assign ship sprite. Assign ship sprite, and we want to get the sprite from our assets. So let's create a new function that returns the starship, the player starship sprite. Get player ship sprite. It's everything not optimal. I think we're going to rewrite portion of this code in the future for sure, because everything must still get clear in my head. So this is all kind of a work in progress, so just bear with it. So return this sprite player starship. Okay, this sounds good. So let's go now in the main file, and we're going to say gassets.getPlayer ship sprite. And you should send it to our ship sprite class, and this is going then to enable it, so it should then appear in the thing. Okay, we got an error. Get player ship sprite is not a function. Get player ship sprite is a function actually, so maybe I didn't save the file. Let's give it another try. Yes, it's working. So we got our player sprite appearing in the world. Awesome. Okay, we need now another sprite, which is our projectile, because we want to be able to fire stuff from our ship. You know what? I should actually, before we go any further, I should actually say Ortho2 to our world, since we're going to work only in 2D. So we're going to make this a 2D world. So Ortho2 will just make the z-axis disappear. Okay, good. So we need this sprite for the projectile. So this sprite projectile 1, let's call it. I think we're going to have more of that. So I'm just going to call it 1. And this is a new sprite. And now load assets. We're going to load this sprite as well inside this function. So this sprite, not player starship, but projectile1 dot load image, and it's going to be the folder path. Plus, we need to choose an image for our projectile. All right. I think I found one. Oh no! You know what? I've cut these sprites the wrong way. They're actually smaller than 32. Now I've cut 4. There are 4 sprites in a single block, so I'm just going to delete them all. Go into my patch, create a new instance of the sprites.sheetslicer. Just go in its help file. Go here into my assets folder. Kenney, a game, tilemap, tiles packed. These are not 32 by 32. I think these are actually 16 by 16. Yeah, that's it. So I'm going to slice them, save them into this desktop folder. Going to the desktop sprites. Folder is empty, didn't export them. There they are. I'm going to copy them, actually Ctrl-X them. Go into the sprite folder inside my project, paste them here. There they are. Okay, good. So the file that we want to have is this one here, tiles packed 12. I'm just going to call it projectile1. Good. So inside our JavaScript file, this is going to load the projectile._1.png. Put a couple of semicolons here. Good. Good. Then actually we want to also get the projectile sprite. So these get projectile1 sprite, and this is equal to this actually looks kind of strange. Let's write it like this. Get projectile one sprite. This is a function that is going to return this sprite projectile one. Okay, great. So let's go into the main file. We want to assign this as well. So going to get player ship sprite. Now get projectile one sprite. Good. Actually, we don't have a projectile sprite inside our player ship class. So let's call it. Actually, we should do like this to be consistent. We should actually write here sprite ship player ship. And then we should have here sprite projectile. Assign it to null. And then assign ship sprite. Let's have another function. Let's just copy that. And let's have another function to assign the projectile sprite. Assign projectile sprite. And this is going to be the proj sprite. Doesn't matter how we call that. And this is the sprite projectile. It's assigned to project sprite, and then we enable it. So assign projectile sprite. I'm just going to copy that and paste it here. Okay, cool. So now we should have, if we load this. Okay, I think our projectile sprite is on top of our ship sprite, and that's because I think we need to give to the video plane the depth enable attribute 0, set it to 0, right? So let's see if this works. Yes. Now we don't know exactly what's the order of the layers, so we don't know which one is on top of which, so we should actually assign a layer, set layer function here inside our sprite. So this set layer inside our sprite class function, and this is our value. So this .vp.layer is going to be equal to val. This is going to decide who's on top of who. So inside our game playership class, we're going to say that the projectile sprite is going to be on top of our ship sprite. So set layer, we're going to set it to 1 since by default the layer is 0. So this should make that our starship is below our projectile. And okay, that's the case. We probably want a projectile much smaller. So I'm going to set the scale of the sprite of the projectile sprite. I'm going to put it much smaller. So this .sprite projectile. You know what? The starship is 0.2, so I'm going to get this as 0.05. Okay, so I'm going to save the main file, and yeah, there it is. It's very small. Maybe let's make it just slightly bigger. So instead of 0.05, 0.08. Save the main file, and there it is. Okay, cool. Now we need to fire this projectile. So let's go inside our player ship class and create a fire function. Right? Oh, and of course we need then to modify the position of our sprite. So let's give here a function. Actually, we should call this set scale sprite, just to be more consistent without sprite. Actually, let's just call it set scale. So then we should call it here when we load the image, set scale. Good. Actually, you know what? We don't need to call this function here. We should just assign the scale of the VP by default to be as our default scale. So this VP.scale is equal to this.scale. Okay, so we don't need to call that function there. It's not really, doesn't really make sense. So set scale inside our player ship. Set scale, we modify the name of the function here. Cool. Now let's create a new function which will set the position. Set position function. Position is going to be an array. So this vp.position, it's equal to pos. We probably want to slice this array because we don't want to make a reference to it. We just want to make a copy of it. So I'm just going to slice it. There's a property, there's some JavaScript stuff. And good, so then we fire it. We say this sprite projectile dot set position. we are going to set it to, we need a current position for our sprite projectile here. So this, let's call it projectile pos. It's going to be equal to the, by default it's going to be equal to the position of our starship. So exactly, this is first going to be null. And then when we assign it, when we assign a projectile sprite, we want to set the position to be equal to the one of our starship. Sprite projectile.set position, which means we also need to get the position of our sprite. So let's create a function called getPosition. First, let's actually create a position property for that class. It's going to be just 000 by default. And then let's get this position. So do we have some getters here? Not yet. Let's create them after the setters. Get position, it's a function which is going to return this dot position. And when we set the position here, we actually want to also, you know what we want to do is to assign this position equal to post.slice. And then we want to assign this position as the position of the video playing position. Yes, like that. Good. So when we instantiate our projectile, we want to say this sprite playership.getPosition. We want to instantiate it to the position of the current position of the starship. Okay, good. So projectile pos is null, set position. Let's sum. So this projectile pos1, so the epsilon position, we could create a vector class to have this working much in a much nicer way. Maybe we're going to do this later. For the moment, let's just say that this is plus equal 0.1. Good. So set position, this is going to be this projectile position. Okay, this is a bit silly. It's not exactly what we are going to do in the future because this position should be updated in the update position. You know what actually we are going to do? We should have here a bang function, which is basically going to be our rendering bang from the world. So the world is going to send us a bang. No function bang. Yeah, of course, I still have to save. Okay, cool. Now we got a function bang. This is called at every frame. And inside this function, we should say gplayership.update. We will call a function called update. And so inside our game playership class, we need to call this up. We need to create this update function. This.update is going to be equal to a function. And basically, in this update function, we want to modify the position of the projectile by 0.1. So what we want to do exactly here is to actually, in the update function, we want to move the projectile. And in the fire function, we just want to instantiate it. So you know what we're going to do? We are just going to actually enable the sprite. So we're not going to do that into the when we assign it, but only when we fire. We're going to enable this sprite, right? And set the position as the starship position. And then in the update function, we are going to move this projectile. Okay, so this should work. Let's see. So here I'm going to save what happens. This projectile pos is null, of course, because by default it's just going to be null. So basically what we want to do is to call this function only if we already have a projectile. So we're going to change all of that probably, but let's say is this sprite projectile is different than null, then do that. You know what? Actually, we should do it if we have fired if we are currently firing. So let's create a variable here, call it this is firing. Let's set this equal to 0. So when we fire, this is going to be equal to 1. So if we are actually firing, then this is going to be equal to 1. Good. So let's actually save the main file, otherwise it's going to keep giving us errors. Okay, so then we should have a way to check when we click on the window. So I'm going to say when we click on the window, we are going to fire. So basically the world is going to give us that if we say send window idle mouse 1, or maybe it's just going to give it us nevertheless. Yeah, exactly. So even if we don't send it nothing, anyway, every time we click on it. So let's actually do this. This is the fourth variable, the mouse button, the left mouse button. So we have that. Sorry, I have said fourth, but I wrote 1. Okay. So okay, cool. When this changes, by default, by the way, I think this is connected to our frame rate, so it's not going to be all the 100% reliable, but for the moment it's going to be okay. So let's say when this changes only. So with a change object, to say when this change, let's call this function, we're going to call it onClick. Yeah. Let's actually call it like this, underscore onClick. And we're going to send this to the JavaScript object. Now we need to create this function. So this is our public function, basically, what we got here, which means functions we can call from Max. So let's create this onClick one, function onClick value. So if val, let's actually call it a button. So if button is pressed, basically, then gplayership.fire. Cool. And okay, and then it's going to update it. So let's see what happens. Okay, this project pos is null line 34 because we clicked, but we didn't yet write. It also doesn't know that there is a function called onClick, because I wrote it wrong. That's why. Okay. So what is your problem? If I load the assets, this projectile pos is null, although this should actually call all of that only if this is firing. Oh, I wrote it in the wrong position. That's why I wrote it into assign. Actually, we have to write into this fire. Silly me. All right, so let's check again. Load the thing. We fire. Projectile pos is null. It doesn't really like it. Why is this null? Let's go into our playership class. Set position. Well, of course, because when we fire, we should actually assign the projectile pos to the position of the starship, and then assign this as our initial projectile pos. Okay, I guess this should work now. Not sure though. Let's give it a try. And there it goes. There it goes. It just fired once and then it's gone. But it's working. So if I now, let's say, delete the object and recreate it, load the thing. Okay, it fired once. Okay, pretty cool. Pretty cool. We're getting somewhere. We just need to say, for example, okay, if this is firing, it does that. Then, if this projectile pos 1 is greater than 1, which is the border of our window on the upper side, this sprite projectile dot enable sprite 0, we're going to disable this sprite. We're also going to say this is firing is equal to 0. Okay, so then we should be able to fire again. Let's give it a try. We need to fix this thing that it doesn't do it. Basically, if I fire but there is no starship yet, it's going to give us an error. So we don't want to fire unless the player ship exists. Okay, we're going to take care of that later. For a moment, let's just try. Boom. Fire it once. Don't fire it anymore. Okay, why is that? I thought we were going to be able to just fire it multiple times. You know what? I'm a bit afraid that this is actually continuously updating this vector, so we actually need to slice it. Otherwise, just making a reference and not a copy of the vector. This could be the problem. Yes, this was the problem indeed. And now every time we click, we're able to fire. Okay, awesome, kind of awesome. The projectile is moving pretty fast. I'm going to make it a bit slower, just half the speed at this frame rate. Yeah, there it goes. Every time I click, it's actually going to restart it, which is not exactly what we want. But okay, everybody, I think I'm gonna stop here. This is already probably super long video, but it was a lot of fun. I hope you had fun too. I really want to make this like something cool. Want to transform this into something cool, and I hope you are with me in this journey. Surely we're going to learn a lot about how Jitter works in JavaScript during this whole thing, and how JavaScript works in general, for what I can tell you. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, and check the patch, download the patch from my Patreon, subscribe to the channel, like the video, this will be really appreciated very much, and I will see you, if you're not too scared, in the next session. Have fun. Ciao.